I think we'll start. So good morning to all of you. Welcome to this session, Designing Project Lifecycles and Workflows in Project Online and Project Server 2013. I hope you had a nice evening yesterday at the party. Did you enjoy it? Good? Not too tired? Ready for the last day of the conference? So my name is Stephen Hayden. I'm a MCS architect based in Paris. I've been working for Microsoft for the last 10 years, and I've been involved in quite large project server deployments since the version 2003. I wrote, so let's start first with the session objectives. The idea of this session is really to show you how now you can build workflow for project server and project online to capture demand. And we'll be covering during this session all the different steps to create this workflow. I will try to explain to you the basics workflow components. And we'll be going through a complete solution to implement this workflow. We will see all the different steps and all the tools that are going to be used. I will also add in this presentation a small demonstration of how you can use SharePoint list to start, in fact, your workflow and capture demand, because that's a new feature in Project Server 2013, which is very interesting to close the gap between SharePoint users and Project Server users. The really nice thing now with version 2013 is that Project Server workflows are exactly like SharePoint workflows. So the good news is that you no longer need to use Visual Studio and have developers to do workflows. So that's really a great step forward, and hopefully you will see that in this presentation. And the idea at the end of this presentation is that you should really find that writing workflows and demand management is easy in Project Server. Related content, there is a presentation later today by Bia, who will be getting in a bit more details on some of the aspects of the workflow architecture. So I will be more covering the user side, where using Visio and SharePoint Designer and creating the different objects in Project Server. Yesterday, there was also a session by Chris Boyd, who was explaining a bit about some of the different architecture bits that might be interesting. But there are all sorts of other related sessions that are interesting. For example, there is currently a session, but you can't be at both times, just closed on development. And Bill Avery is presenting one of a tool that could be used for workflow packaging at one point. So as I told you, the agenda will be following the process of a custom workflow creation. We will start with vision phase, where we will define exactly what we want to do. Then we'll go through a planning and specification by specifying all the different steps, stages that this workflow will go through. Then we will start building the workflow using SharePoint Designer and Project Online. And then we will be deploying and see what are the different tools we can use to deploy and debug the workflow. What's important to also know is that I wrote a white paper called Hitchhiker's Guide to Demand Management. You will find all the information that I present in this deck in this white paper. So in case you missed something or I'm going too fast, you can find all the information. Who knows about this white paper? Okay, good. Do you like it? So I made the first version of this white paper for Project Server 2010, where it was really a new subject where you had to go through Visual Studio, and it was quite difficult, let's say, to do a workflow. And I updated the white paper to include the 2013 version where using SharePoint Designer. So let's start with the vision. Who's going to be involved in the workflow and demand management creation? So we have the business user, of course, that he's the most important one in the because he'll be using the solution. So he's the one that is going to be putting value into the workflow you're building. So he's going to be involved in the vision phase and the planning phase, and then a bit in the deployment and the use of the workflow at the end. We have then the PMO, who will be also involved during the vision and a bit during the create and configuration, also during the deployment. And we have the PMO power user or admin, who will be the user who will be really defining the workflow, creating it, and making the orchestration. One thing you must note is who's missing in this table of actors? The developer, because a developer is no longer needed now. In the 2010 version, I had another column here where I was adding Visual Studio, but now in 2013, you no longer need one. You can, of course, use and have a developer if you want to go more deeply in building specific activities. And Bia, this afternoon or at around lunchtime, will present how you can use Visual Studio. But for the moment, we don't need any developers. So what's going to be the vision and scenario? So what's currently Contoso process for having a new project? It starts with a written specification. They send this written specification by email. It gets filtered. At one point, somebody opens this, decides it's going to be a good project. It's currently being scheduled in Excel and nice reports. So that's the solution Contoso was using so far. But now we use Project Server. They can really build a new process. And we can express what's the business need. It all starts with an idea. This idea is captured, and it's processed and triaged through a validation process. At one point, it gets approved or refused, depending on what are the idea of whether it's part of the general, if it's valid as a project or not. When it's approved, it gets assigned to a project manager who can go forward and move in the process. So how do we create such a business process and workflow? 4 steps. So we start by planning the workflow using Visio 2013. We then create the different objects in Project Server online. We then create the workflow in SharePoint Designer using also Visio, because we will see that Visio, in fact, is completely integrated inside SharePoint Designer. Of course, you have to have it installed both on the PC. And then we deploy the workflow and we associate it to an EPT. So these are really the 4 steps to remember when you want to create a workflow. So let's start with the plan and specify. So this is the workflow that we are going to implement. It starts with the idea collection. The user will say whether funding is necessary or not. If no funding is necessary, there's no approval that's needed, and we will go directly into the manage execution. And at the end of the project, we will capture some post-mortem information about the project. If the project needs funding, then somebody needs to approve it. So we will send a specific task to the lead approval, and he will decide whether he approves the project or not. If he approves the project, then we move into the execution phase. If not, then the project is canceled. Fairly easy workflow, but it shows different steps, sending email, approving. So it's basic, but you will go through different steps. So here's the result of this workflow using Visio 2013. So we find here the idea collection, whether or not the funding is required. If no funding is required, then we go into the inform and select otherwise and approval. So let's have a look at this workflow in Visio now. So when you start Visio, so Visio is a drawing document, is a drawing application. So when you start it, you are not connected to any project server session or site. So you are just working on your desktop. So you start Visio and you want to create a Microsoft SharePoint 2013 workflow. So you start by creating it, selecting metric units or US units. Then you have your dashboard, and you have a first stage that's available. Then when you want to add other stages, you use all the shapes that are available for SharePoint and Project Server activities. So although as Project Server is a fully SharePoint workflow, you will be using all the different activities of SharePoint that are available. So you will not see explicitly in Visio creating a project server workflow. You will be creating a SharePoint workflow. And in this workflow, you can use specific activities. And so here, we will see all the different actions that can be done. And you will see that among some of the actions here, you will find some wait for event, update items, stages, all the different conditions here that are available. Here you see that you can create a project from a current item. You can set a project status. So here in the phase of the planning, you don't want to go too far in defining all the different actions. You want to maybe just build the big picture on the different stages. So in our case, it was the idea collection, testing if funding is required or not, approval. So you may not want to go into too much detail because at this level, we are not implementing the workflow. We are just planning it and designing it. So let me open a solution already of this workflow. So we have here the, is it big enough? Yeah. So we have here the stage idea collection. We have the test. If it requires an approval, if it gets approved, we went into the inform and the execution phase. What's interesting to note here is you have some SharePoint designer properties here, but they are currently grayed because we are still only at the shape level. We are not connected yet to any systems. And you will see that when we import this diagram in SharePoint Designer, then you can fill up all those different properties. So that was just the introduction about doing the Visio demo. And here in the presentation, I'm showing some pointers to a specific blog article from the Visio team, which explains a bit more about using designing workflow for SharePoint. And here in this article of MSDN, you have the list of all the different shapes that are available in Visio for SharePoint. So in designing this workflow, we need first to define the different phases. Phases are going to be a way of grouping stages together. So we've identified a create phase, a select phase, a manage phase, and a finished phase. Inside each phase, we will be having some specific stages, which are steps inside the phase, and user will be inputting data, and there will be output of data for each stage. So we have to define and all that. Then inside the stages, we will be using some specific activities which are available for SharePoint workflows, assigning tasks, sending an email, doing some specific condition testing. Then we'll be using some specific project-related objects, which are called the project detail pages, or PDP. We will be putting some specific web parts inside those PDPs, and we'll be using some specific custom fields to capture the information. And then we'll be associating this workflow to a specific enterprise project type, and then when we create a new object of this type, we will start the workflow and go through the different stages. So here I'm using also a Visio specification, which is very useful because in this, not simple diagram, let's say, but complete diagram, we specify everything that we'll be needing when we are creating the different objects. So the idea of this diagram is really to specify all the different phases using a specific color. And in this stage here, idea collection, I'll be using a specific PDP, which is called idea collection. Then during the lead approval, I'll be showing the PDP. And a nice thing in workflows with the project server is you can decide if a PDP is read-only or read-write. So the idea, of course, is when you start a workflow, people enter information, but once it's got approved, people can only have a read access to this information. So using this specific, let's say, design document, we can specify when a field or a PDP should be read-only or read-write in the workflow process. Also, in this, I say when I send an email to the project manager, here I'm in the execution phase, where I have the different PDPs available and have the schedule one. And once the project is finished, I go into the post-mortem phase, where I enter information about the project. And by using the specific colors here, it's fairly easy to read the workflow. And so by giving this, for example, to the project server administration, he can create all the objects and doesn't have to think about whether, well, is that read-only? No, it's read-write, and so on. So let's go in the build and create phase now. As I mentioned already, in the workflow configuration, we need to create certain numbers of objects in project server. And we need also to follow the hierarchy of objects because some of these objects are included in others. So you can't create a high-level object if you haven't created first the object it's going to contain. So it all starts, as with project server, with custom fields. So these are going to be the objects in project server where you're going to capture the information. And we will see later in the demonstration that when you create a custom field, you say that this custom field is going to be controlled, or its behavior is going to be controlled by a workflow. Then these custom fields are going to be put inside web parts. And we will see which web parts we can use. These web parts will be put inside PDPs. These PDPs, project detail pages, will be available inside the stages. And these stages will be available inside a phase. And finally, we create an EPT, which englobes all this data. So if we go a bit deeper in the steps now, we see that a workflow development can be decomposed into 3 high-level steps. First, in PWA, we will create the enterprise custom field, then the project detail pages, then the stages and phases. Once we have created these objects, we can go into the real workflow development and use SharePoint Designer. And we will see that when we start SharePoint Designer, we open the PWA site and we connect to this site. And we will see that all those different stages and phases will be available when designing this workflow. We can use also at this level Visual Studio if we want, if we're still a bit developer. But that's going to be covered this afternoon by Bia. And Visio here is going to be used under the, automatically is going to be used by SharePoint Designer, because SharePoint Designer, as we will see, is going to have 2 views, depending on whether you are a textual person or a graphical person. And you can use either what's called a text designer, which is really a designer, as we will see, where it's basically text that you enter, and you will enter the different conditions. Or you can have also a visual designer. And the visual designer is, in fact, a simple ActiveX of Visio inside SharePoint Designer. Then, once we have defined the workflow using this tool, we can upload or publish the workflow inside the PWA, and we can create the enterprise project type, which is going to be available for this workflow. So we've seen what are the objects that we need to create in project server: custom fields, lookup table, web parts. We can use default, or we can have our own custom web parts. project detail pages, stages, phases, and enterprise project type. When I first started to work with workflow, I was a bit, let's say, overwhelmed with all those different types of names. And so this is why I'm repeating it several times, because you need to really get into it to first understand and see how you can use them. But it's not really complicated. It's just new concepts that you need to understand. So let's have a look at how we can create these objects. So maybe I forgot to ask a question. Who's been developing workflows already? So, okay, so that's half of the room. So maybe you will see things that you already know, but for the other half of the room, it's going to be new. So let's. So we go in project server, in the server settings here. So I'm using here an online environment. So all that is available online. So we go into the enterprise custom field, because we will start first by defining the enterprise custom field. Before defining the custom fields, we need to define some specific lookup table that may be. So if you remember well, we had a first question on the funding, on the idea whether this idea was to be funded or not. So we create a lookup table, funding required, with two values, yes, no. So at this level, we are not specifying it's used by a workflow. It's when we are defining the custom table, the custom field that is using this lookup table here, that we mention here that the behavior is controlled by workflow. So by using this specific setting, project server knows that this field is going to be used by a workflow. So we needed to define this custom field. And otherwise, yes, we also have some specific fields. If we look at all the workflow controlled, we have on budget reason, these are fields that are going to be on the post-mortem PDP. And we have the funding required. So we are not using a lot of enterprise custom field in this simple workflow. So after defining the custom fields, we need to check the web parts. So in our case, I'll be using simply the default web parts that are available. So I don't need to create a specific web part. And next thing is to define the PDP, the project detail pages. So this is done here. And I've already defined the idea collection web part. And here, if I edit this page, we see that it's a web part. And this web part is the basic information web part, where we can define all the fields that are going to be available and that are going to be displayed on this PDP. So here you just select the fields. So this is why it's important first to define the field, because if you haven't defined the field, then you cannot have access to them in the PDPs. So here you just put the different fields, and you can put a specific naming convention. And you can, of course, use all the default project server fields that are available. So that's the idea collection web part. There's another web part, which is the postmortem web part, which is defining three fields: lesson learned, on budget, and reason. Also, one important thing here in the PDP is whether the page type is going to be simply a project PDP, or if it's going to be used when you create a new project. So in the case of idea collection, the page type is new project, because this is the first PDP that is going to be displayed when creating a new project. So then we've defined the PDPs now. If we go, so next thing to do is to define the stages. And here, as you can see, I have several workflows that are defined on this PWA instance. So I've prefixed all my stages by using S1, S2, S3, so that it's easy to find them when we have defined several stages. And it's always good to have a specific naming convention, because you will see that when we are using SharePoint Designer, it will show you these stages in the alphabetic order. So it's good to use a specific naming convention to have them in the right order. So if we look at the S1 idea collection stage, we see simply its name, a description, in which phase it appears, what page is showed, what's the workflow status that is showed in the project detail pages, what are the PDPs, project detail pages, that are going to appear. So we have the idea collection and the project details. We can specify information here that is going to be visible for the user. And here we choose what are the custom fields that are necessary for the, and these are the required custom fields. So that means that as long as the user hasn't filled up a value inside those custom fields, we cannot move forward in the workflow. The system will really ask for them to get a value. Here we have the read-only custom fields. So for the moment, we don't have any read-only custom fields because we are just starting the workflow. And here, so these are the different values we specify. So if we look at the lead approval, PDP, we will see that we are now in the select phase. We still show two PDPs, idea collection and project details. We no longer have required custom fields, but we have now read-only custom fields. These are the values that are in the idea collection PDP. And of course, we cannot, the approver cannot modify these values. They are read-only. And if we look at the last interesting stage, which is the post-mortem one, we will see that in that case, we have 4 PDPs, idea collection, project details, schedule, and post-mortem. We have some required custom field because these are the values that the user has to enter, lesson learned, on budget, reasons. And we still have the old read-only custom fields, funding required, and cost. So we've created the stages, we've created the phases. So phases, you will see, I missed that, but it's just a name. There's nothing really about a phase more than just a grouping. So we've defined all the different objects in Project Server. So we're ready for the next step, but let's have a few more slides before. So we've created the objects in Project Server. Now we need to start the workflow design. So we will see that the workflow is attached to a SharePoint site. The SharePoint site is going to be the PWA site collection. We will be defining some specific workflow activities. So workflow activities are going to be things like sending an email, doing a test, setting a value to a custom field. You will see that there are a certain numbers of predefined activities that you can use. We will be using the workflow designer of SharePoint Designer to do that. There are also some workflow services that are happening behind the scenes. These are more going to be defined in the next presentation by Bia. And then we will see how we can package this workflow. So what are going to be the actors that are involved in each of these steps? So we've already seen that all the PWA configuration here for creating the enterprise custom field, the project detail pages, the stages, this is going to be done by the administrator of the PWA solution. Then the workflow creation that is done in SharePoint Designer and Visio. It can also be done in Visual Studio. This is going to be more done by what's called the business analyst, the person using SharePoint Designer. It's not really a developer. It's somebody who knows about the process and how to use SharePoint Designer. Then once these objects are created, we need to associate the workflow to the enterprise project type. So this is going to be done again by the PWA administrator. And then when the workflow is going to be used, this is really going to be the work of the business user of the solution. He's going to create a project using a specific enterprise type. And then the system will behave and execute the workflow behind the scenes. So this is done by the different system actions. So it will start the workflow, do some checking test, and move forward in the stages or not. And at the end, and it will display the required PDPs for the users. So let's see how we can use SharePoint Designer now. So we move here. So here I've started SharePoint Designer. So I need to connect to a specific site. So is it already started? No. Okay. So I'm connected to the PWA instance here. If I select workflow, I can see the existing workflow. If I want to create a new workflow, what's that noise? It's coming from, okay, it's not me. Sorry for the noise. So if I want to create a workflow, I can use site workflow here, give it a name, and this is the important bit here, is selecting SharePoint 2013 Workflow Project Server. You can see in your choice that you can use 2010 workflows, which is not interested for us here, or just SharePoint 2013 Workflow. So by the way, this is in our case, I'm on the online environment using Project Server. So this is, of course, working fine and it's fully configured. But when you are on an on-prem solution, if your workflow has, in Project Server 2013, workflow installation is a separate component that you install and configure in your file, your SharePoint file. So there are some specific steps to do. And that's a good way of checking if you've done all the steps correctly. If you don't see SharePoint 2013 workflow in your list, it means that your workflow setting is not correct. So you need to recheck your configuration. In our case, online here, it works fine because, of course, it's configured. So I create my workflow. And I start here with an empty stage. And here, as I am connected to the PWA instance, I should see the list of stages that appear. So I can find here S1 idea collection, S2 lead approval, S3 inform, S4 cancelled, and so on. So you see that SharePoint Designer now is connected to the project server instance, and I'm getting all the information that I've created. So now it's really a question of using the right tool and specifying our workflow. But you may say that I've been using Visio earlier. So maybe it would be good if I could use the actual Visio that was defined earlier so that I don't have to retype all those different stages. And so, of course, that's the good thing to do. So in order to use Visio, here you do not need to create the workflow first, but you have to just close it here. You have to, when you are on the workflow choice here, you want to use import from Visio. And import from a Visio 2013 diagram. So I specify project workflow. So it's generating, and here I'm finding the workflow that was designed earlier. And now here I need to specify the links on the different stages that are really being used in my project server. So if I select properties here, I need to select S1 idea collection. So this is the work you have to do when you import from Visio. You have to do the correct mapping between your shape, which is really not linked to any other objects. And here you have to do it manually. So that's the mapping each objects of your Visio diagram to the right SharePoint project server. That's the inform. That's the cancel. And that's the execution. So here I'm inside SharePoint Designer, but I'm using the Visio Designer. This is possible because on my PC I have both SharePoint Designer and Visio installed. So that's the requirement in order to be able to use this specific tool. So let's say now that I've done my all the different settings. I'm in the Visual Designer mode here. So I can go in the, I need first to save it, I think. Okay. Oh yeah, I need to generate the workflow. And now I can move to the text-based designer. So here I find the workflow in text mode, because of course I find it personally more efficient to work in the text-based version than the Visio. Visio is good to start, to design, to do the big picture, but then once you want to move forward, you use the text designer. So here I still have some work to do. So here I quite like in my workflows to first start with an action, which is to wait for a specific project event, which is when project is submitted, so that I arrive on my PDP page and I first have to submit my PDP so that it sort of starts the workflow and move forward. So I quite like to start each stages. That's more something I do in the design phase and when developing the workflow. So here I need to test the funding required, if you remember well. So here, this is the data coming from project data. And here I can see that I should be having funding required. So if funding required equals yes, then go to lead approval, otherwise go to inform. Lead approval. So I can wait for the project event when project is submitted. And here I will create a specific action for. So here I only see the actions that I've recently used. If I want to see all the different actions, I want now to assign a specific approval task to for the lead approval to validate or not the workflow. So here I select as participant. So here I can see that I have all the different groups that are available in my SharePoint collection list. So I can either specify a specific name or I can use a group. So I tend to use one of the default groups, which is the lead approvers, project web app, project managers, don't find them. Okay, let's use the portfolio managers for this example. So here I can specify a task. So what's nice is that I can enter text and I can also add some specific values here. So I can put the project name. Okay, that was more in the text. I can specify a due date. And so when the task is going to be sent, there's going to be an answer from the approver, whether it approves or not this specific task. So I can test the variable, and here I can test the, so that's going to be a task. A workflow variable, and the variable outcome, whether it's approved or not, and so on. So I can define all the different workflows. And once I'm ready, I can check for errors, and I can publish it. So I've made some mistakes, and I know it's not complete, so that we can see how we can debug later the workflow. So it's published now. So if I go back inside PWA, I can now define my EPT. And here, in the site workflow, I should see the workflow I just published. So here, I select what is going to be the starting PDP page. So this is where it's important to specify the right PDP page that is a starting newer project, because this is where you see it in this list. And you can specify different things in the PDP. You can use a specific project plan template, a specific project site template. Okay, and now we can create the enterprise project type, and we can start this project. It takes a second here. And what was the name I used? Is it the second one? Yeah. Thank you. So here, so let's start with no funding for the moment and put cost of 0. So that's going to start the workflow here. I see processing. So it takes a couple of seconds to start the workflow. So when I arrived at this level, I still don't have the submit here, which means it's not yet ready completely. So I need to refresh once or twice, depending on the load of the server. Okay. So here, I know that I've reached my submit. You know, if you remember in the workflow, I said wait for project event submit. So I can submit, and I will move forward into the next stage. And here, I can get more information. So I've done with the first phase. So if I refresh the page, I'm here at my submit button. And as this workflow didn't require any funding, then I went directly into the post-mortem. I should probably have gone to the manage phase, but I maybe didn't follow all the different steps inside the... Okay, so here you see, cannot submit the workflow because I need to specify some values in the post-mortem PDP page. Okay, now I can move forward in the workflow. It should be okay. So that was the test when no funding was required. If I create now another project, okay. So now I should go into the steps with the lead approval. But normally I should hit an error. So if I refresh, I submit. Refresh again. So I'm in the lead approval section. So if I submit, I should be getting in the approval. So a task should be sent to the lead approver. And here, what I wanted to show you is if I need to get more information about the workflow, I use this button here, this additional workflow data. You see it here? I can get more information about the workflow. So here I see that a new task was created. And what I really wanted to show you is here. In Project Online, you don't have access to some specific workflow information and status. And this is the only place here where you see that what's happening with the workflow. So when something goes wrong, as this is the case here on our case, because the error I made was that I selected a group, the portfolio, the SharePoint group portfolio approver, and this group is empty. There's no user. So the system doesn't know where to send the email. And this is what it's saying here is that it cannot send an email to an empty address. So, but still, the workflow made some progress because it created the task, and I can approve it or not. But so this is the only place where you can see what's happening on the online. So that's on the workflow data page and internal status. We will see another technique later on how to get more information when debugging your workflow. So here I can say retry, but it will never reach because there's no email. Well, okay. So that was the creation of the workflow using SharePoint Designer. But maybe I can use a real example that works. Let me use another, which was this one. So in that case, I won't be hitting the problem. And what's nice also with Project Server 2013 is that you have this new web part which shows visually where you are in the workflow. This was not the case in Project Server 2010. So we are now in the lead approver. We move forward. Okay, so normally an email should have been sent. Okay, so here when a task was assigned to the user, an email is automatically sent. So I can approve project. So to approve the task, so now the task was approved. So if I go back in my PDP page and refresh it, I should move forward. Okay, just wait a few minutes. Let me check. Oh no, it was the wrong. Okay, check. Was I on the right test? Test. Oh no, that's the old one. The one that's broken. My project was named Test. What was the name of the project I created? Test 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, that's the one. Info completed. Yeah, that's the one because it's. No, it's not the one. Okay. Okay, I will just check a bit later. Let's go back. There's a few more slides to check, and if you have questions. So we've been using the workflow with SharePoint Designer. And we've been testing it. So now I just wanted to show you how you can use a SharePoint list to capture the demand. That's another way of starting the workflows and creating a project. The idea is that we are more in the innovation management here, and we can create an enterprise project from a SharePoint list. The idea here is to be able to mass create some projects. You have users that are going to use a SharePoint list to capture the demand. They're just going to fill up the different fields in a specific custom list that you define. And we will see that when we create a project, we make a mapping between the SharePoint column and an enterprise custom field. So how to do that? You first create a custom SharePoint list with specific columns, which will be later mapped to the enterprise custom field. And this list of items can be promoted to projects. And there is just one requirement, is that in order for this specific action button here that's available in SharePoint, you need to create this SharePoint list in the site collection where the project server service is enabled. So because of course there's a need for SharePoint to communicate with project server. And then we will see in the demonstration that first thing the system is asking is to do the mapping between the SharePoint column and the enterprise custom field in project. It also asks you what are the enterprise project type you want to associate with this SharePoint list, and it creates the project. So let's have a look. So here I have my list, So I can create new items. So great idea for today. Funding required, no. In a perfect world, everything is free. I create another item. Okay, so you can imagine that this list is created either manually by users, or you have another SharePoint workflow that creates those lists. And here, I select the two elements here, and here I have the create project. So that fires up a dialog which propose a default mapping. So, of course, if you use the same name for your column than the project custom field, the system will automatically propose the right word. So in that case here, funding required, proposal cost, so it's got them correctly. And here you choose which enterprise project type you want to use, and you can create your projects. And so this will create the two projects, and you can see the details. Okay, yes, here I made a mistake that I misspelled yes. I should have used capital letters or small letters in the system. So I don't know what did, let's see if it created the project, but probably I have to don't see yet the project. I don't see the project. Hasn't been published yet, or? All right. So, last step is deploying and debugging. We've already covered part of it. What's important to know is that the workflows are linked the question is, how do you deploy your workflow from a development environment to a QA or production environment? Because, of course, you should not be developing your workflow on a production system without first testing it on a development environment. So workflows are still linked to PWA instance because they are linked to the different objects that were created, the custom fields, the stages, and so on. So we will see how we can use Visio 2013 to export the workflow from one PWA instance and re-import it into the other instance. And then we will copy the workflow, and we will see how we can debug. So as I mentioned, the different IDs of project server objects are stored inside the workflow, but it's also storing the name. So we will see that when it tries to import the workflow from Visio, it will try to do a mapping of the names between the two instances. So if you use the same name for your objects in project server, it will do a matching. Otherwise, you will have to manually reselect the different objects so that the workflow works. So how you do that? From SharePoint Designer, you first connect to your instance, to your development instance, so you export it to Visio. Then you get out of SharePoint Designer, you connect to your new instance or to your production instance. You also need first to create and copy the different objects from instance A to instance B. For the moment, we don't have a good solution for that that's available in Project Server 2013. We used to have a tool called, it was called, missing the name, Playbook, exactly. That was the name, Playbook of the tool. Yet it hasn't been ported to. It cannot be used for SharePoint for Project Server 2013 yet. There are solutions, and I think that Bill Avery was presenting a solution in his talk that allows you to sort of package all the different Project Server objects inside a specific WSP, and then you can move these objects from one instance to another. In my case, I simply recreated manually the 2 or 3 custom fields and objects stages. So once you've created the objects in Project Server, you import the workflow from Visio, and you verify if the objects are matching and then voila, you have your workflow that is copied from one instance to another. I will maybe skip the demo because I'm running a bit out of time, so I want to leave time for questions. Just before wrapping up, how do we debug a workflow? So I already showed you that for the workflow that was created online. So the only step you have here is the workflow status, which shows you textual message on what's the current stage of your workflow, whether it's working or not. So that's called the workflow status page. Otherwise, unfortunately, the only way you can use to debug is to use what's called the old-fashioned way. There's a specific action called log history, which logs all the actions that you are doing, and you can put some specific actions inside your SharePoint designer, and so you can try to follow what's happening and whether it's or not going. So for the moment, there's no real good solution. That's for online, of course. For on-prem, you can use more information that's available. You can use the ULS logs, which are, of course, not available when you are online. And you need to look for some specific keywords in the ULS logs, and I've listed them here. SharePoint Foundation, start workflow, entering activity. There are also some specific logs for the workflow component, the Azure workflow server, which is installed. So that's it. So we've covered today the different steps to create a workflow. So we started with the vision phase, where we've identified the actors, identified the business needs, and we've been using Visio and Visual Designer to facilitate. Then we've entered the plan and specify, where we define the process, we define the different objects you need to create in Project Server Online. Then in the build phase, we've used the SharePoint Designer and Visio to create the different objects. And finally, we've deployed the workflow. And also I showed how you can use the SharePoint list to capture demand and create automatic project. So that's it. Thank you very much. So do you have any questions or topics? Yeah. Please, can you come to the mic so that the questions get recorded?
For the ones that we can create using SharePoint lists, should it be on the, for Project Online, should it be on the Project Web App instance of it? I mean, the Project Online instance of it? Or could it be another SharePoint which is outside of?
You need to be on the Project Server. Because, yeah, you need to have an instance which is validated with a Project Server service. So if you are in another SharePoint instance where you don't have project server, you wouldn't see this specific button which says create project from SharePoint list.
And have you had experience with, in the event that is not the case, an external SharePoint list form that can get imported in here? Is that?
Well, you need to put in place a process that would copy your external list to a list that's available for project server. So that would be one way of doing it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
How is the workflow considering versioning, meaning if you have changes afterwards in the workflow and some projects are already going through their life cycles?
So what happens? So the question is, what happens when you update your workflow and you have ongoing workflows? So you can still use the ongoing workflows, but they will not capture the new or updated workflow activities that you've put inside your workflow. You can terminate your workflow normally still using the old version. Or you can decide if you really want, you need to sort of use the new activities that you've defined, you can restart the workflow and then you will be using the new version.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yep.
Okay. Do you know if there's any way of the workflow status or the workflow progress, the web part? Is there a way of using your own custom graphic in that? Can you...
on the online version? Or?
Yes, can you visualize your status with the custom graphic?
I don't know if, no, sorry. Maybe you can ask Bia.
Yeah.
I'll talk later.
All right.
Yeah,
thanks.
I don't know.
No.
Hello, I have 3 workflows that are about the same with slight differences. Is there a way to copy a workflow in the same environment, call it a different name, and then make those adjustments? Or do you have to recreate it from scratch?
No, you can use Visio. If you export your workflow to Visio,
right,
and then when you re-import it, you can specify a new name. And
yeah, I tried that. Where do you specify the name? In Visio or when you?
No, it's when you import it.
Okay.
You specify a name for your workflow. So,
okay, I'll give that a try.
Yeah.
Thanks.
It's a bit sort of, you use Visio as a sort of pivot format, but it works fine. So.
You have enterprise field and you define that that is managed by the workflow.
Mm-hmm.
Does that have any side effects on the enterprise field itself? Or is it just that it's visible when you define the workflows?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
So, when you have enterprise field...
Yeah, enterprise custom field?
Yes,
yes,
and you need to define that it's managed by workflow.
Mm-hmm.
So does that have any side effects somewhere else in the system? Or is it only defining that this field is visible and available for SharePoint Designer when you design the workflow?
To my knowledge, it doesn't have any other effects. Maybe you could confirm that later with Bia. I will ask her, but for me it hasn't got any other side effects.
But it can be used in other
It can be used as a
enterprise.
normal custom field. I mean, you can access it. The only difference is that you cannot modify this custom field outside of the PDPs. Because for example, if you could modify the field outside the PDPs, this means you would violate the read-only options you've specified.
So it's still available in
It's
MSP
available
for
for read, but not for update. The field can only be updated using a PDP. Because otherwise, this would allow to sort of change the total cost of the fundings and things like that. So,
so for example, it can't be updated in MSP?
It cannot be updated, no.
Okay.
Because it has to be done through the PDP pages.
Okay.
Okay, so I think we're done for this session. Thank you very much.